I can't claim to fully understand what took place in that secluded cabin, nor can I offer any solid proof of what I experienced. What I can confirm, this qualifies to be among cabin in the woods horror stories. But what I can tell you, without hesitation, is that it was the most harrowing night of my life. A memory burned into my mind, a terror I carry with me still. It all began a few months ago when I set out on a solo backpacking trip through the White Mountains of New Hampshire. I've always found comfort in nature's raw, untouched beauty. The solitude of the forest had long been my refuge, a place to quiet the noise of the world and reconnect with something deeper. But this trip was different. Something went wrong. I had planned a multi-day route through one of the more remote areas of the range, a trail not frequently traveled and known for its demanding terrain. Things started smoothly enough, but I misjudged my timing. By late afternoon on the second day, I realized I had strayed off course. The sun dipped faster than I anticipated, and within minutes, twilight bled into dusk. As the forest thickened and darkness crept in, my sense of direction unraveled. My map was of little use under the dimming sky, and panic began to take root. I needed shelter, quickly. That's when I saw it. Tucked away behind a wall of pine trees was a small, dilapidated cabin, almost swallowed by the wilderness around it. It looked ancient, forgotten. The wood was darkened by age and moisture, its roof sagging under years of neglect. The windows were broken in places, and the front door hung loosely on rusted hinges. And yet, in that moment, it felt like salvation. With no other options, I approached cautiously and pushed the door open. It groaned under its own weight, revealing a dim interior coated in layers of dust and debris. The scent of mold and rot hit me immediately, earthy and suffocating. A single room stretched before me, sparsely furnished with a battered armchair, a toppled bookshelf, and a small hearth filled with ash. The remnants of whoever had last stayed there seemed untouched for decades. Despite the overwhelming sense of decay, I convinced myself it was safer than remaining exposed to the elements. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the least offensive part of the floor and settled in, telling myself it was only for one night. As the hours passed, an uneasy quiet settled over the cabin. It wasn't the normal stillness of night, it felt oppressive, heavy, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Then the sounds began. Not loud, not even distinct at first, just faint whispers, too quiet to decipher, but unmistakably human. They seemed to come from the walls, then the ceiling, then everywhere at once. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps rodents scurrying through the woodwork. But the more I tried to dismiss them, the clearer they became. At some point during the night, I noticed a painting above the fireplace. I swear it hadn't been there when I arrived. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all standing in front of the same cabin, smiling brightly. Their expressions, however, were unsettling. Their eyes seemed too wide, their grins frozen in a way that felt unnatural. And no matter where I moved in the room, their eyes followed. Unease gave way to dread. I tried to distract myself by exploring the rest of the structure, what little there was. Toward the back of the cabin, I found a narrow hallway that led to a tiny study. Dust coated everything, and cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling. On a desk in the corner lay an open journal, its pages yellowed with age. I picked it up, drawn in by curiosity that quickly turned to horror. The entries were written by a man who, like me, had stumbled upon the cabin seeking shelter. At first, he described it as a fortunate discovery, but his tone shifted with each passing day. He began to hear voices, first whispers, then screams. He wrote of seeing shadowy figures in the corners of his vision, and of a painting that changed its expressions when he wasn't looking. His final entry was short and frantic: "They are in the walls. I can't leave. I'm not alone." My blood ran cold. The journal slipped from my hands and landed on the floor with a thud that felt deafening in the silence. I wanted to run, to get out of that place immediately, but something kept me there. A strange pull, like the cabin itself, didn't want me to leave. That night, sleep was impossible. The whispers intensified, overlapping and circling my thoughts until I could no longer separate them from my own inner voice. I stared at the ceiling, trembling, as shadowy shapes flitted past the broken windows. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart lurch. Time lost all meaning. Minutes felt like hours. By dawn, if it was dawn at all, I was barely functioning. My limbs were weak, my mind frayed. The painting had changed. The smiling family was now distorted, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes black and hollow. They seemed to glare at me, accusingly. I knew then that I couldn't stay a moment longer. Summoning what little strength I had left, I grabbed my gear and bolted. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe until the trees opened and I reached the edge of the trail again. Only then did I risk a glance behind me. The cabin was gone. Where it had stood was nothing but thick forest. No path, no structure, not even a clearing. As if the woods had swallowed it whole, or as if it had never been there in the first place. Since returning home, I've tried to learn more. I've scoured maps, reached out to rangers and locals, but no one knows of any cabin in that part of the forest. No records exist. No one believes my story. Sometimes, I even question it myself. But late at night, when the world grows quiet and the wind howls through the trees, I still hear the whispers. And I know it was real. If you love scary cabin in the woods stories, or haunted cabin in the woods stories, then you are in the right place. We focus on delivering such strange and mysterious stories. Please subscribe so that you will never miss any of our uploads. Also, please like our videos. It means a lot to us. Long before I ever drew my first breath, my parents had already carved out a piece of solitude for themselves in the northern reaches of Arizona's White Mountains. They built a modest cabin nestled in the pine-covered hills, an escape from the bustle of everyday life. That place became a cornerstone of my childhood, and a scene for part of creepy cabin in the woods stories I'm about to share. We spent every chance we could up there. Summers stretched long and slow under the towering trees, and long weekends like Memorial Day became treasured rituals. It was our second home. My parents had friends nearby with kids my age, and we quickly formed a tight-knit group. Most of our time was spent running wild through the woods, building forts, daring each other to climb higher, jump farther, or explore deeper into the shadows. Like all kids, we entertained ourselves with local legends and ghost stories. There was one tale we passed around more than others, about a strange, abandoned property down the road from our cabins. It wasn't just folklore to us. It existed. You couldn't miss it, even if you wanted to. Just off the dirt road that led to our cabin was a massive open field. In its center stood the haunting remains of a property that looked like it had been swallowed by time. The structures were strange and mismatched, a towering green two-story barn, a rust-colored airplane hangar, a whitewashed tractor barn that leaned with age, and a house perched up on a lonely hill. That house had a single tree beside it, the only tree in the entire field, and it was always filled with crows. That image alone, the dark birds against the peeling paint of the house, felt like something straight out of a horror movie. As kids, we never dared go near it. If we were feeling especially bold, we'd inch up to the edge of the property line before chickening out. But everything changed as we grew older. The thrill-seeking instincts of our teenage years made the idea of exploring the place too tempting to resist. By the time I was a sophomore in high school, we had made the abandoned property a regular haunt. We snuck over at dusk, sometimes even at night, flashlights in hand, fueled by adolescent curiosity and just enough bravado to override our common sense. Inside the various structures, we discovered all kinds of strange relics, old machinery, rusted tools, empty cans, scraps of furniture. Most of it was forgettable. But one day, I opened a drawer in a small workshop near the green barn, and what I found shook me. Inside was a worn-out notebook, a Jar Jar Binks notebook, the kind kids had in the late 90s and early 2000s. It looked familiar. Too familiar. I opened it and was hit with a wave of disbelief. Scrawled across the pages in messy, childish handwriting were my name and my siblings' names. Inside were crude drawings I remembered making, and scorekeeping notes from games we used to play together as kids. It was mine. There was no mistaking it. But that wasn't the worst part. At the very back of the notebook, written in handwriting I didn't recognize, were notes, strange ones. Scribbles. Names. Phrases I couldn't make sense of. Neither my siblings nor any of my friends knew how the notebook had ended up in that abandoned workshop. It should have never been there. It felt wrong, like a thread of my past had been pulled into a place it didn't belong. We should have stopped going after that. But we didn't. By that summer, we'd even claimed the upstairs of the workshop as a sort of hideout. We brought old cushions, flashlights, and snacks. The place became ours. Despite the creaking floorboards and strange noises we sometimes heard in the distance, we convinced ourselves it was just the wind or wild animals. We were invincible. Or so we thought. Then came the summer of 2012. I had just turned 16, and I was obsessed with dirt biking. My best friend Logan and I spent entire days exploring the forest trails. That summer had been wet, monsoon rains nearly every day, but on one rare, dry evening, we decided to take the bikes out and, eventually, make our way to the old property. After a quick dinner back at my family's cabin, I hopped on Logan's Suzuki DR200 while he took the smaller Honda 125. I reached the property before him and rolled up the driveway, stopping near the old hangar to wait. The bike idled beneath me as I sat, taking in the scene. To my left was the green workshop. In front of me stood the deteriorating white tractor barn. The barn had seen better days. Massive doors meant for farm equipment lay in broken piles, long since detached. The smaller, regular-sized entry door was still somewhat intact, tucked a few feet in from the outer wall. The structure was riddled with windows, most of them too grimy to see through clearly. As I sat there watching the dirt road for Logan's arrival, something moved in my peripheral vision. I snapped my head toward the barn. Nothing. I brushed it off as a trick of the fading light. Still, my eyes kept drifting back to that doorway. Then I saw it. A pale, slender hand curled around the edge of the doorway. A moment later, a second hand gripped the wall just below it. And then, a face emerged from the shadows. It was human, or at least vaguely human. Sickly pale skin, sunken features, and two black, reflective eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It stared at me in total silence. My heart began to pound, and my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. Couldn't look away. Then it smiled. Its lips peeled back to reveal small, jagged teeth, teeth not meant for smiling. That was the moment I knew it wasn't just some squatter or a person playing a prank. This thing wasn't right. And it wasn't friendly. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable growl of Logan's bike approaching. He pulled into the driveway, just as I tore away, yelling for him to turn back. I passed him in a blur, and he didn't hesitate. He spun around and chased after me, no questions asked. Back at the cabin, we were both pale, shaking. I began to tell him what I saw, but he stopped me. He'd seen it too. Through one of the barn's side windows, just before I shouted, he'd seen the same pale face watching him. Neither of us ever stepped foot on that property again. A few years later, new owners bought the land and tore down the buildings. Including the barn. I'm 25 now. I still visit our cabin regularly, and it still feels like home. But that night in 2012 is etched into my memory. When I sit alone on the porch and look out over the darkness that blankets the pasture, I sometimes wonder if it is still out there, waiting in the shadows. And I know, deep down, I'll never forget those eyes. There's an experience I had back in 2017 that still lingers with me like a shadow, refusing to fade with time. I've turned it over in my mind 100 different ways, but the memory refuses to dull. I was 16 then, old enough to feel independent, but still young enough to think I could rationalize away the things I didn't understand. That fall, I took a trip up to northwestern Maine. My grandfather needed a ride to visit my uncle, who lives deep in the forest in a small, hand-built cabin. My uncle is on my mom's side of the family, the side tied to our indigenous roots. The land they live on has been in our family for generations, and it's far from anything you'd call civilized. It's surrounded by dense forest, and once the sun sets, darkness pours in like ink. The cabin itself was modest, just enough room for my uncle, aunt, and grandfather to live comfortably. With limited space, I was asked to sleep in the camper, which sat about 100 yards back into the trees, set apart from the main cabin like an afterthought. The first evening unfolded as you'd expect. My aunt cooked a hearty dinner, and we sat around the small fireplace, trading stories and laughter. It felt warm and familiar, like all the best parts of a family gathering. But the sense of comfort didn't last long. As the night crept in, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the camper. The path there was nothing more than a narrow trail worn into the pine needles. About halfway down, I paused, turned off my flashlight, and looked up. The stars were brighter than anything I'd ever seen in the city, dozens of constellations flickering in the black sky. I stood in awe for a moment, just letting the silence soak in. But that's when I noticed it. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was unnatural. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant call of owls, just a heavy, suffocating stillness. The kind of silence that seems to press against your skin. Then came a sudden, unshakable feeling. Dread. It dropped into my stomach like a stone, and every hair on my body stood on end. It felt like the woods were watching me, like something out there was holding its breath. Instinct screamed at me to move, to run. I listened. I sprinted the rest of the way to the camper, heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door behind me, twisted the locks, and yanked down all the blinds. My pulse echoed in my ears. I laughed nervously at myself, brushing it off as a case of spooked nerves and an overactive imagination. Still, I couldn't sleep. All night long, I heard sounds outside the camper. At first, it was subtle, soft crunches, faint snaps, the kind of noises you could easily write off as a deer or raccoon. But they persisted. They circled the camper. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but the longer it went on, the less convinced I became. My dreams were strange and filled with faceless shadows, whispers I couldn't understand. Morning came, and with it, a sense of reluctant relief. Everything looked normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping again, and the woods felt less heavy. I debated telling my grandfather about the night before but kept it to myself, worried he'd laugh it off or chalk it up to city boy jitters. Instead, I pushed it aside and spent the day enjoying the fresh air, helping chop wood, and playing fetch with Frank, their big German shepherd. Frank was loyal, sharp, and never far from my side that day. That night, I didn't want to be alone again. I asked if Frank could sleep in the camper with me. My uncle gave the okay, so when night fell, Frank and I made the walk back down the trail together. At first, everything seemed fine. But as we entered the tree line, Frank's body language changed. He slowed, his ears perked straight up, and his head moved from side to side like he was tracking something I couldn't see. By the time we reached the camper, he was tense, his tail rigid and hackles raised. It made my skin crawl, but I didn't say anything. That night was quieter, but not in a comforting way. I drifted into an uneasy sleep. At some point in the early morning, I awoke from a vivid, nightmarish dream, one I couldn't remember clearly but that left a sense of terror in its wake. Frank was sitting upright on the bed, staring intently at the camper's wall. His fur was bristled, ears flat, body frozen like a statue. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just watched. I didn't sleep again after that. By mid-morning, I was packing up my things, preparing to leave later that afternoon. I let Frank out and decided to play with him in the clearing between the cabin and the woods, hoping to distract myself. We kicked around his favorite ball, laughing and enjoying the sun. But then I kicked it too hard, and the ball rolled to the edge of the forest, coming to rest just beyond the shadows of the trees. Frank took off after it, his stride full of energy, until he stopped dead in his tracks. His body went rigid, staring into the trees. He didn't move. I called his name. Nothing. I called again, louder. Still nothing. He didn't even flinch. Worried, I jogged over and grabbed his collar. His eyes were locked on the woods. I gave a little tug and shouted his name. That's when it happened. From somewhere deep in the trees came an echo. But it wasn't just any echo, it was my voice. Calling Frank's name. Only it didn't sound right. It was delayed, distorted, like someone imitating me but getting the rhythm and pitch just a little off. My blood went cold. I stared into the trees, holding my breath. Then it came again. Louder. Still my voice. Still not my voice. Without another thought, I grabbed Frank and ran back toward the cabin as fast as I could, heart hammering, not daring to look back. Bursting through the door, I was in tears, rambling to my aunt about what I'd heard. She hugged me, soothing me, telling me it was probably nothing. But her voice betrayed something else. She sounded worried. Like she knew more than she was letting on. I left that afternoon and haven't returned since. Maybe it was my imagination, maybe it was just the forest playing tricks on me. But I know what I felt. And I know what I heard. Something was in those woods. And it sounded just like me. What do you think about these true scary cabin in the woods stories? Tell us in the comments section. When I was younger, my father owned a number of properties, cabins, condos, even a couple of storefronts. He always seemed to have something going on. We never lacked anything growing up, and I knew from an early age that we were well off, even if we didn't live extravagantly. Looking back, though, there was always something off. Something about how he earned his money never sat right with me, even as a kid. He told us he ran his own accounting firm in the city. Long hours, business trips every other week, constant fatigue in his bloodshot eyes. His presence was rare, and when he was around, he always looked like someone running on empty. I didn't learn the truth until my second year of college. My father was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for laundering hundreds of millions of dollars for drug cartels. The scope of it was mind-blowing: offshore accounts, shell corporations, false identities. All the things you think only exist in movies. 2 weeks after he was taken into custody, my mother, who had been implicated as his accomplice, took her own life. She left behind no note, just silence. I guess the reality of her world unraveling was too much. Not long after, the government seized nearly everything: the bank accounts, the businesses, the homes. Everything, that is, except one piece of property: the old cabin in the woods. The cabin was remote, tucked into the wilderness of upstate Vermont, completely isolated from cell service and civilization. It had been a summer retreat during my childhood, the only place I remember spending real time with my father. Maybe the authorities overlooked it, or maybe it was in my mother's name. Either way, it remained untouched. It took me a long time to rebuild a sense of normalcy. Therapy helped. Psychedelics helped more than I'm proud to admit. Eventually, I made peace with what had happened, or at least enough to function. I graduated, found a decent if uninspiring job in an office downtown, and settled into a rhythm. A boring rhythm, sure, but one that kept me going. About a year later, I felt the strangest urge to go back to that cabin. Maybe it was nostalgia, or maybe I wanted to face the last remnant of my past that I'd buried. I didn't want to go alone, though. So, I asked 3 friends from university, Jack, Pedro, and Randy, to tag along for a weekend trip. We'd get out of the city, drink, relax, maybe fish a little. It sounded simple. The journey was more difficult than I'd expected. The narrow dirt road that led to the cabin had been overtaken by nature, making it impossible to drive through without risking serious damage to the car. So, I left the vehicle at a nearby lot, and we hiked the remaining 1.5 miles through the woods. The first couple of days were peaceful. The cabin, though dusty and in need of a little love, still stood strong. We spent our time drinking cheap whiskey, smoking even cheaper weed, and reminiscing about our university days. It felt good. Light-hearted. Normal. By the 3rd night, we depleted our food supply. Rather than cut the trip short, we decided to make a late-night trek to the only nearby diner, a 24/7 Greasy Spoon about 30 minutes away. The walk was uneventful, and the food was exactly what you'd expect. But as we made our way back to the cabin around 2 a.m., a strange scent drifted in on the wind, smoke. At first, we assumed it was someone having a late bonfire, but the smell grew stronger, thicker. As we approached the cabin's clearing, we could see a flickering orange hue bleeding into the night sky. My stomach dropped. The cabin was engulfed in flames. The fire was massive, devouring the wooden structure like it had been waiting to do so for decades. Smoke billowed into the night, and I could hear the crackling of collapsing beams over the rushing in my ears. I barely remember dialing 911, just the sound of my own voice, shaky and strained, telling the operator that the cabin was burning down and that we needed help. She told me the fire crew wouldn't reach us for at least 30 minutes. So, we backed away into the woods, the air thick and acrid around us, and we waited. Then something changed. It started with the sky. One moment, the trees were lit in that warm, eerie orange glow. The next, it was gone. Not dimmed, gone, as if someone had flipped a switch. The air cleared in seconds. We looked at each other, confused. I asked if they were seeing what I was seeing. They nodded, equally stunned. We crept back toward the cabin, unsure what we were going to find. There was no fire. No heat. Just scorched ruins, blackened timbers and collapsed ash. The destruction was real, but the fire had vanished without a trace. That's when Pedro called out from the far side of the wreckage. "Guys, what the fuck is that?" We rushed over. What we saw didn't belong in any forest. Nestled in the wreckage was a corpse, or something that resembled one. At first glance, it looked like a large animal, maybe a bear, but as we moved closer, the illusion fell apart. Its skin, where not charred, was a sickly pale, almost translucent, and carved in symmetrical, spiral patterns. Its limbs were too many, long, thick, and jointed wrong, and its massive jaw, the only part of its face left intact, was filled with jagged, pitch-black teeth. Worse still, it was cradling something in its arms. A baby. Perfectly unharmed. Not a mark on it. No burns. No smoke in its lungs. Its eyes were closed, its chest rising and falling slowly like it was asleep. My stomach turned. We stood frozen, caught in some collective daze. Then the chanting began. At first, it was barely audible, a whisper beneath the wind. But it grew. Louder. Rhythmic. Words that almost made sense, like English twisted at the edges. It sounded human, but not quite. And it was getting closer, fast. We didn't wait. No one said anything. We just ran. Branches scratched our faces and arms as we barreled through the woods. The chanting was all around us now, as if we were surrounded by unseen speakers pumping the sound from every direction. I could feel it in my chest. My teeth. My bones. We reached the car, piling in like our lives depended on it, which they might have. As I jammed the keys into the ignition, the chanting reached a deafening peak, and then stopped. I looked up. Dozens of figures stood at the forest's edge. Not moving. Not speaking. Just watching. They were human-shaped, but grotesquely tall, 8 feet, maybe more. Their limbs hung at unnatural angles, and their faces, if they had any, were obscured by the shadows. Every instinct in me screamed to drive. And I did. Faster than I ever had. I didn't stop until we reached the diner again, only now it was surrounded by police cars and emergency vehicles. I parked and staggered out, finding an officer near the entrance. I asked if they were here about the fire. He looked confused. Fire? No. Has there been one? I explained what had happened, carefully avoiding any mention of the creature or the chanting. His face didn't change. He jotted something in a notepad and told me they'd check it out and follow up in the morning. I thanked him and turned to leave. I have never found answers to the incident because the police seem to avoid the issue altogether. I think this is among true scary cabin stories worth noting. Thanks for watching till the end. Remember to check out more of our true cabin horror stories. We are dedicated to availing strange stories each week. Please subscribe to keep track. Also, like our videos. It matters to us a lot. Let's know your thoughts about today's true scary cabin stories in the comments section.